What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today's video, we dive into some of the changes coming to the cards that we already have in MTG Arena with the release of Alchemy. I'm going to be diving into the cards that really affect the top end decks that are getting changed. I am not going to target those cards that, no one is technically really playing, especially at the high meta, just because we really don't know what the effects of the positive changes that those cards have. We're just going to really looking at the nerfs from the cards that are in like the top 4 decks, I think, currently in the meta, with them being Alchemy Epiphany, Mtg Chariot, Luminar Aspirin, and what's the other one? Faceless Haven. Those are the cards we're going to be looking at today in today's video, talk about the changes that are going on with them. Like I said, they impact people who are going to be playing the new Alchemy set. I'm probably our Alchemy format. I'll more than likely dive in myself, kind of check it out, kind of see where the power level is. I don't think these changes are going to dramatically alter the popular decks currently. I think it's going to take some time before we see what other decks can pop up. Also, with the new cards being added, it's going to take some time to play test and kind of see which decks can be made out of the new cards that are going to be injected into the game overall as a whole. But with that being said, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here and want to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. With that being said, let's just take a look at the cards and let's talk about them. All right, so the first card we have is Alchemy Epiphany. If you don't know what this card does, essentially the current version that is in the game in standard is a 7-mana spell that creates 2 bird tokens and with flying, and take an extra turn after this one and then exile Alchemy Epiphany. You can also foretell it by casting 2 colorless during the early turns and then casting it for 6 mana for its foretell cost, getting a slight discount than the overall 7 drop card that are 7 drop spell that is the card itself. The change that is happening is because of the Epiphany decks and copying Alchemy Epiphany and taking a bunch of extra turns and taking a possible empty board state with, say, having 0 birds on the battlefield and all of a sudden having 4 birds and then untapping 2 more turns to go forward and possibly kill your opponent depending on what your board state is, or completely flipping the game. The new version is essentially taking away the advantage of casting a full Alchemy Epiphany without having to foretell it. Also taking away that slight discount, making it that you have to pretty much cast it once you have 7 mana available or on the battlefield. So it is that other thing. So also the other thing too with Alchemy Epiphany is that only the foretell copy of the card gets the birds. The copy of it with Galvanic Intervention will not get birds. So you really only net a second turn, but you don't get any additional birds. So the idea here is, like I said, it's so that combo there can't swing a game from pretty much maybe your opponent being behind because it is a control deck. The goal here is to take advantage of the late game and play expensive spells to get big swings and then take the game into your favor. This essentially eliminates the copy and then overwhelming birds, and also allowing your opponent to essentially, depending on what the game state is, win from wherever they're at, essentially not allowing you to proceed forward and possibly have a chance to combat that possible combo. We also don't really have a counter spell currently in the format that will allow you to counter multiple spells on the stack. We only have a direct individual counter spells. The only way you can technically counter something that is being copied on a stack is by copying the spell you're countering with, or having multiple counters to then copy each individual spell, and that is kind of unlikely. So like I said, this is kind of the idea why the philosophy with this card is being changed. Like I said, it's only going to impact the new Alchemy format. It's not going to impact if you're a standard only player, and I understand, I guess, why they can't do things like this technically in standard and physical, just because you can't tell people like, hey, this card doesn't do what it says on the thing. It actually does this instead. There's no way to fix physical versions of the card. And at the same time too, it's one of those benefits, like it could see one of those things because the way the card is very powerful. The real way that Wizards has done it in the past is they'll technically ban the card. We haven't really ever had a restriction of how many copies of a particular card you have in the library, so it's kind of interesting that we're just, the only way to really deal with it in physical would just be to ban the card, which is still a possibility because standard's still going to be format. But at least in digital form and with the Alchemy format, for now they can nerf it and not make it as powerful, but it is still a very strong spell. The decks may evolve a little bit, may go a little bit more on the Is It Dragons with Epiphany in there, just take those extra turns to be aggressive that way. Only time will tell, but that's the change there. Let me know what you guys think of the Alchemy Epiphany change down in the comments below, but let's move on to the next one. Let's talk about it. So the next card up is kind of an interesting one, and it's kind of hard to see whether this is a net positive, net negative, or kind of like a neutral card, and that is with the Mtg Chariot. A Mtg Chariot, if you don't know, is a 4-mana artifact legendary vehicle that when it enters the battlefield, you get to create 2 cat tokens that are 2/2s, and it has a crew cost of 4, which means you have to tap creatures with power 4 together to activate a Seeker's Chariot into a creature. And then whenever a Seeker's Chariot attacks, you get to copy target token you control, whether it's another cat token, it's a token from Red and 6, or even a treasure token, depending on what kind of deck you are playing. So it is kind of one of those interesting things that is, the ability of this thing. And the card itself, even if you get rid of the Seeker's Chariot, you then have to deal with the tokens that it may have possibly generated. So it's kind of like the idea why they limited the amount of cat tokens that it is producing as the first thing. We are only now going to get a 1 cat token, so you're not going to have to deal with a 4/4 and then multiple 2/2s depending on what the situation is. The other thing they changed on is that they actually lowered the crew cost, so you only have to tap creatures with power 2 or together. So this is kind of interesting because at least the 1 cat can crew it, but you're not going to have a bunch of cats. The other thing is, even if your opponent wipes the board state, as long as you have a power 2 or greater creature, 1 creature can essentially power up a Seeker's Chariot. You may not get the benefit of copying tokens. So that's the other thing that's kind of interesting here. So it's kind of hard to see whether this is net positive, net negative. It is also one of those things with the card that it may fit into more decks because the crew cost isn't as high, and the Seeker's Chariot can take benefit of that. But yet again, who really knows exactly where this really falls? Is the card as powerful as it once was? I'm not really sure. It's maybe one of those things that maybe goes from having 4 copies of in the deck to, because it was much, I feel like it was an overall stronger card originally than how it is now, to then possibly only having 2 copies or a couple, not as many copies, just because 1, it's a legendary artifact, you only have 1 on the battlefield, and 2, it's not as strong because you're not going to, change the board state by, putting 2 cat tokens on the creature, and then on top of that have a 4/4 that you can activate whenever you decide to crew it 4, and then getting copies of tokens that way. But it's one of those things. It's just it's trying to understand where this kind of change affects, where it falls in mono green, where it falls in other decks like maybe not Grixis, maybe in Gruul, things like that. I mean, let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. I don't think it's going to really affect the mono green Stompy style decks, as I do think they'll still probably play this card for the effectiveness, to copy your cat tokens, to copy possibly wolf tokens, to copy your Ren and 6 tokens. It still does all of that. It's just now you only have to crew it for 2 instead of having to crew for 4, so I think it's a positive there. So the next card up on the list is Faceless Haven. It's essentially, if you don't know what this card is, it's a snow mana land source that produces colorless mana, and then for 3 snow mana you can get a 4/3 creature that is all creature types, so it can be any creature type depending on what kind of deck you're playing. And it has vigilance, so whenever it attacks, it doesn't have to tap to attack. The change they're really doing here is just taking from a 4/3 to a 3/3. And to many people, it's one of those things that I think you don't really realize how drastic of a change that is. A 4 power is, in general, that takes the game from being X amount of turns down to 5 turns. Because essentially you'd have to attack 7 times from your opponent being at full life in order to get them to death, whereas with a 4/3 you only have to attack 5 times, so it drastically reduces the amount of time that you have time to catch up against this particular card. So it allows you to create answers against this particular card. It still has the 3 toughness. It is still susceptible to all that other removal that can hit something with 3 toughness. But yet again, it's kind of like that way to combat it being so strong, being a 4 power creature. Because I like until you really see it, you really don't understand how great of a change that is. Because a 3 mana 3/3 just overall doesn't look as good as a 3 mana 4/3. But with that being said, it's gonna be interesting to see how many decks are gonna go away from snow mana. I think the mono green deck will still play snow mana, still play Faceless Havens, just because it's still a great card. You still get a creature land that kind of just works with your snow mana overall. It helps with your things like Blizzard Brawl and things like that. But decks like mono white, or decks like any decks that play snow may not consider Faceless Haven anymore, just because maybe the creature lands are just overall that much better. Though the mana cost is a lot greater, it's that kind of trade-off that you may have to kind of deal with. But with that being said, it's kind of like an interesting change that doesn't really seem like it affects a lot, but I think it will affect a lot when it comes to what creature land type choices you're going to make in the particular deck you are playing. So the next card up is Goldspan Dragon, and this one's kind of another interesting change, just because I think initially back maybe when standard before it rotated in like 2022 standard and kind of like leading up to the current standard we're in, Goldspan Dragon was kind of that card you kind of saw all over the place. And essentially Goldspan Dragon is a 5 mana 4/4 flyer with haste that whenever it attacks or becomes target of a spell, you get to create a treasure token, and its other ability is treasures that we control now produce 2 mana of any one color. The change that we're doing here is they're actually removing the ability here that if it gets targeted, it creates a treasure token. So now it only, whenever it attacks, it creates a treasure token, which to me allows it to be interacted with, because what situations that would happen here is, for example, if it's like an Is It deck, Is It plays blue, so there's a possibility of playing counters. You target with like a removal spell, it then generates a treasure token because it's being targeted with a spell. You can then target, you get 2 mana, which then can be used to play like a negate, or in turn can be used to then possibly even bounce it back to your hand, triggering another treasure to be generated and nullifying that, and then there's no net negative of mana possibly being reduced. So it's kind of one of those things that they kind of wanted to reduce the advantage of it being targeted, because it kind of makes it harder to be dealt with in that sense, because you get a mana advantage when it's out on the battlefield when it gets targeted by a spell. Do you want your opponent to possibly get X amount additional mana in exchange to get rid of 1 card? Because the possibility is, depending on what the situation is in the board state, it is possible that they could just replay it again with it being targeted by removal. Who really knows? But it's one of those things that we'll kind of see how strong it is. I do think it's still a great card. Making treasure mana produce additional mana is very good. It's still a flyer. It is still a haster. It is still a 4/4. So I do think it's a very strong card. It's just not as strong, so it can be dealt with in many ways. I think the Is It Dragons decks will still play this card just because of how good it is. But other than that, I don't know if we'll see it in all the decks that splash red or play red creatures. So who really knows, and how, what other cards may overtake it in the 5-drop slot. With that being said, let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. But with that being said, let's move on to the next one. So Luminar Aspirin's the next one that kind of affects mono white right off the bat. It is a 2 mana 1/1 that doesn't seem very good, but the ability that it does is that at the beginning of your combat, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature control, and essentially that ability is going from that ability to, at the end of your end step, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature control. So their mindset is that if a mono white player is going first and they play their 1-drop, like their 2/1 soldier, and then they play Luminar Aspirin on turn 2, their soldier now is a 3/2, and it's getting that 1 additional point of damage really before your opponent has really any time to set up. I think the idea here is it kind of slows down the mono white game, because the idea is a Luminar Aspirin, and especially multiples of them, can make a game go out of control pretty quickly before your opponent can really deal with anything on the board state, because by the time that the 3rd turn rolls around, that creature now could possibly even be a 4/3, and then it gets out of certain spot removal spells, especially if you're playing some sort of burn. Other than that, it's just to tone down the overall strength of the card as a whole. Yet again, it's only a 1/1, so it's easily targetable if you want to get rid of it, but it's just also, it just slows down that aggro matchup with mono white. I still think it's a great card. Just instead of getting the counter in the middle of the turn, you get it at the end of the turn. So, it's an eventuality that you'll get on the next turn. But like I said, it allows you to kind of, hopefully being against it, it will allow you to kind of interact with it before it gets out of hand. Does it turn the card into an unplayable card? I don't think so. But at the same time too, there may be something that maybe I'll play this instead in the 2-drop slot instead of this. And, we'll kind of see that evolve and kind of change as the meta develops in Alchemy. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Is this one that, you really think should have been changed or not been changed? And it's kind of interesting overall how the cards are kind of going. And as much as I want to dive into like the other changes that are happening, I just figure like these are the ones that are really happening to the meta decks that are currently in the current meta. Now, like I said, if you continue to play standard, these changes won't affect you whatsoever. But if you're looking to dive into Alchemy to maybe get away from the current standard meta, these are the changes that you'll expect on cards that are already printed. And then we'll have to wait and see what the cards that they're introducing alongside of these changes will kind of do for the meta as a whole. With that being said, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out a lot. If you're new here, want to post new videos on the channel, hit that subscribe button. Until next time, I'll see you later.